The cold wind that swept through the broken door of the ranch house did nothing to cool the burning rage in Cassidy Flynn's chest. His hands were shaking, trembling with a mixture of adrenaline and a terrifying sense of helplessness that he hadn't felt since he was a child. But he wasn't a child anymore. He was standing over the broken body of his father, Gideon Flynn, a man who had been immovable as the mountains themselves until 3 hours ago. The silence of the house was heavy, broken only by Gideon's shallow, ragged breathing. Blood, dark and sticky, matted the old man's gray hair and stained the front of his shirt blood that wasn't supposed to be there. 3 hours ago, the world had been simple. Gideon had been fixing a fence line near the creek, the sun high and bright, the air smelling of pine and dust. Then the riders had come. 7 of them. They hadn't come for conversation, and they hadn't come to trade. They came with the arrogance of men who knew the law was too far away to matter. Cassidy closed his eyes for a second. The image of the leader burned into his mind. A man with cold, dead eyes, and a beard trimmed with unnatural precision. He stood over Gideon, watching his men work the old rancher over with rifle butts and boots, treating the violence like a necessary chore. They wanted the land. It was the same old story that was bleeding the territory. Dry speculators and ruthless men pushing out the small holders. They said the territory was changing, that men like Gideon were relics of a past that didn't fit into their future. Gideon had told them no. He had told them the land wasn't for sale, not for gold, not for threats. And so they had beaten him until he couldn't stand, until he couldn't speak, just to show they could. "You have 1 week," the leader had said, his voice terrifyingly calm as he wiped a speck of dust from his coat. 1 week to sign the papers. If you don't, we come back. And next time, we don't leave anyone breathing. They had ridden off, leaving Cassidy kneeling in the dirt, the taste of dust and failure in his mouth. Now Gideon lay on the floor near the fireplace, his face pale and swollen. Cassidy had managed to drag him inside, cleaned the worst of the wounds, but he wasn't a doctor. He could see the unnatural angle of his father's ribs, hear the wet rattle in his chest. Gideon's eyes fluttered open, finding his son's face. There was no fear in them, only a crushing resignation that scared. Cassidy more than the violence had. Gideon thought this was the end. He thought he was going to die here, defending a patch of dirt against men who had no honor. But Cassidy remembered something else. He remembered the shadows that sometimes moved in the periphery of their lives. The figures that most settlers in the territory spoke of with dread but whom Gideon treated with a quiet, sacred respect. He remembered the Apache. Most ranchers lived in fear of the tribes, keeping their rifles loaded and their doors barred. But Gideon Flynn was different. For 40 years, he had lived on this land not as a conqueror, but as a neighbor. There were nights, years ago, when riders would appear not to raid, but to sit by Gideon's fire. They would share food and speak in low tones, a language Cassidy didn't understand but felt the weight of. He remembered the way those warriors looked at his father not with hatred, but with the reverence one gives to a legend. Cassidy stood up, the decision crystallizing in his mind like ice. He couldn't fight 7 men alone. He couldn't shoot fast enough or aim true enough to take them all down before they killed him and finished his father. But he didn't have to do it alone. "Don't," Gideon wheezed, seeing the look in his son's eyes. The old man tried to lift a hand, his fingers trembling. "Cassidy, don't go to them. It's too dangerous." Cassidy knelt, gripping his father's hand gently. "I don't have a choice, Pa. They're coming back. If I stay here, we both die. I have to try." He didn't wait for an argument. He grabbed his coat, his rifle, and stuffed his saddlebags with dried meat and 2 canteens of water. The Apache camp was a 2-day ride to the northeast, deep in the broken lands where the rock turned red and the canyons twisted like snakes. It was territory that swallowed white men whole, a place where the U.S. cavalry didn't dare to patrol. Cassidy looked back at the house one last time, seeing his father's broken form framed by the doorway, and then he mounted his horse. He turned the animal's head toward the jagged silhouette of the distant hills and kicked it into a gallop. The journey was a blur of exhaustion and anxiety. Cassidy rode as if the devil himself were snapping at his horse's heels. He pushed the animal hard, navigating through scrubland that slowly gave way to towering rock formations. Night fell, bringing a biting cold that seeped into his bones. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the leader's cold smile, heard the sickening sound of boot striking bone. He rode by moonlight, trusting his horse's footing on the treacherous trails. By the second day, the landscape had changed completely. He was in the heart of the Badlands now, a maze of stone and silence. This was their land. He knew he was being watched. He could feel eyes on him from the ridges, invisible sentries tracking his every move. It was a test, he realized. If he showed fear, if he drew his weapon, he would be dead before he heard the shot. He kept his hands visible, high on the reins, riding with a deliberate slowness that screamed clearly, "I am not a threat. I am a messenger." By noon, the sun was beating down mercilessly, shimmering off the red rocks. His water was low, his horse foaming at the mouth. Just when he thought the heat would take him, he saw a thin trail of smoke rising from a canyon to the east. He turned his horse toward it, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He stopped at the entrance to the canyon, a narrow throat of rock. He didn't call out, he just waited. It was the way his father had taught him. You don't demand audience with the Apache, Gideon had said. You wait until they grant it. Minutes stretched into an hour. Then, without a sound, a warrior appeared on the ledge above him. He was young, holding a rifle with casual ease, his face painted with the markings of a scout. He stared down at Cassidy, impassive and unreadable. Cassidy swallowed the dryness in his throat. I need to see Natan, he said, his voice cracking. He didn't know if the warrior spoke English, but the name was enough. Natan, the chief who had sat by Gideon's fire. The warrior's eyes narrowed slightly, but he gestured with his chin. Follow. The camp was larger than Cassidy had imagined. A sprawl of shelters tucked into the natural fortress of the canyon. As he rode in, silence rippled outward like a wave. Men stopped sharpening knives. Women looked up from their work. Children froze. All eyes were fixed on the white boy with the blood-stained shirt riding a weary horse into the heart of their sanctuary. Cassidy dismounted, his legs nearly giving out. In the center of the camp, standing by a large fire, was a man Cassidy recognized instantly. Natan? He was older now, gray streaking his hair, but the power radiating from him was undiminished. He looked at Cassidy, and for a moment, the air was thick with tension. He knew. Natan looked at the boy's face, the desperation etched into his features, and he knew that disaster had come to the Flynn ranch. Cassidy walked forward, stopping 10 paces away. They beat him, Cassidy said. No preamble, no pleasantries. The words tumbled out, raw and painful. 7 men. They beat Gideon Flynn in his own yard. They broke his ribs. They left him for dead. Natan's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. Why come here, boy? Natan asked, his voice low and resonant. Why bring your trouble to my people? The white man's wars are his own. Because he's dying. Cassidy stepped closer, ignoring the murmurs of the warriors around him, and because he told me a story once, about a flood, about a boy he pulled from the raging water when no one else would jump in. The silence in the camp became absolute. Natan went very still. He told me he carried that boy for miles, back to his father. He told me that father was you. Cassidy's voice shook, not with fear now, but with the sheer weight of the plea. They're coming back in 5 days to kill him and take the land. I can't stop them, but you can. Nathan stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. The death? It was a ghost that had walked between them for years. A life for a life. The chief looked around the circle of his warriors, seeing the expectation in their eyes. To turn away a debt of honor was unthinkable. To ignore the man who had saved his own flesh and blood would be a stain that no rain could wash away. Natan looked back at Cassidy, and the hardness in his face shifted, replaced by a fierce, terrifying resolve. He didn't shout. He didn't make a speech. He simply turned to the warrior beside him and spoke 2 words in English, loud enough for Cassidy to hear, loud enough to seal the fate of the 7 men who had dared to touch his friend. We ride. The return journey was not the solitary, desperate scramble that the ride-out had been. It was a thunderhead rolling down from the mountains. Cassidy rode at the front, but he was no longer alone. He was flanked by Natan and 12 of his best warriors. They didn't ride in the disorganized cluster of a posse, but in a loose, fluid formation that seemed to flow over the terrain like water. They moved with a terrifying speed, their unshod ponies finding purchase on rock and shale where Ranch horse had stumbled. There was no talking. The Apache riders were silent, their faces set in grim determination. They were not just riding to a fight. They were riding to balance a scale that had been tipped, and there was a ceremonial weight to their silence. Cassidy glanced at Natan. The chief's face was painted now, a single black stripe running across his eyes, the mark of war. It made him look less like the man Cassidy had spoken to by the fire and more like a spirit of vengeance carved from the red stone of the canyon. They pushed the horses hard, cutting the 2-day journey down significantly. They had to. The deadline was burning like a fuse. When the Flynn ranch came into view, sitting vulnerable and small in the vast valley, Cassidy felt a knot of nausea tighten in his stomach. It looked too quiet. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, but there was no movement. Had the bandits returned early? Had he failed? He kicked his horse into a full gallop, leaving the war party momentarily behind as he raced toward the porch. He threw himself off the saddle before the horse had fully stopped and burst through the front door. "Pa!" he shouted, his voice cracking. The inside of the cabin was dim. Gideon was where Cassidy had left him, lying on the pallet near the hearth. He looked worse. His skin was the color of old parchment, and his breathing was a wet, laborious rasp, but his eyes were open. He turned his head slowly, and relief washed over him when he saw his son. But then his gaze shifted to the open door, and his eyes widened. Natan stood in the doorway. He filled the frame, his presence sucking the air out of the room. The chief didn't say a word. He walked into the house, his moccasins making no sound on the wood floor, and knelt beside the man who had once pulled his son from a raging river. You look like hell, Gideon, Nathan said quietly, his English heavily accented, but clear. Gideon managed a weak, painful smile, coughing as he tried to shift his weight. You look like trouble, Natan, the old man wheezed. I told the boy not to go. Natan placed a hand on Gideon's shoulder, a gesture of rare tenderness. The boy has more of you in him than you think. He reminded me of a debt. Debts must be paid. Natan stood up, the tenderness vanishing instantly, replaced by the sharp, calculating look of a general surveying a battlefield. He turned to Cassidy. How many? He asked. 7, Cassidy replied. They have Winchesters and Colts. They're confident. They think we're just dirt under their boots. Natan nodded, walking to the window and looking out at the scrubland that surrounded the house. 7 men who think they are lions, Natan murmured, but they are just jackals. And jackals walk into traps. The next 24 hours were in guerrilla warfare. Cassidy watched, stunned, as the ranch he had known his whole life was transformed into a weapon. Natan didn't want to shoot out from the windows. That was the white man's way, a siege that could end with the house burning down. The Apache way was different. It was about becoming the land. Under Natan's silent commands, the warriors began to disappear. They didn't hide behind the barn or the trough. They vanished into the landscape itself. One warrior dug a shallow depression in the dirt not 20 feet from the porch, covering himself with a dusty blanket and scattering dry brush over it until he was completely invisible. Another climbed into the rafters of the barn, melding into the shadows. 2 more took positions on the low ridge overlooking the approach, settling in behind rocks with the patience of vipers. They removed anything that could reflect the sun. Conco's polished steel. They rubbed dust on their skin to cut the shine. By sunset, the ranch looked completely deserted. Cassidy stood on the porch, looking out at the yard. He knew exactly where 12 men were hiding, yet he couldn't see a single one of them. It was terrifying. He stayed on the porch, Natan told him as night fell. The chief was stripping off his heavy shirt, preparing for the heat of the coming day. Sit in the chair, with your father's gun. You are the bait. Cassidy swallowed hard, nodding. And you, Natan pointed to the roof of the house. I will be the hawk. The wait was the hardest part. The sun rose on the final day, bathing the valley in a deceptively peaceful golden light. The air was still, hot. A hawk circled high above, screaming once, piercing the silence. Cassidy sat in Gideon's rocking chair, a Winchester across his lap. His hands were sweating, making the wood of the stock slippery. Inside, Gideon was propped up in bed, a pistol in his weak hand, refusing to be defenseless. High noon, the heat waves were shimmering off the ground when Cassidy saw the dust cloud. It was small at first, just a smudge on the horizon, but it grew rapidly. The rumble of hooves reached him long before the riders did. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Steady, he told himself. Don't look at the ground. Don't look at the barn. Look at them. The 7 riders materialized out of the dust, slowing their horses to a trot as they approached the yard. They were relaxed, laughing among themselves. Why shouldn't they be? They were coming to collect, expected a broken old man and a terrified boy, maybe a deed signed with a shaking hand. They didn't draw their weapons immediately. Their arrogance was their shield, the leader rode in front. It was the same man, the cold eyes, the trimmed beard, the fancy coat that looked out of place in the dust. He stopped his horse 10 yards from the porch, looking down at Cassidy with a sneer of amusement. Well now, the leader called out, his voice carrying easily in the stillness. I see you're still here. I assume that means you've got some papers for me to sign. Boy, or are we going to have to do this the hard way? The other 6 men fanned out behind him, chuckling. One of them spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the clean dirt of the yard. My father isn't signing anything, Cassidy said. His voice shook, slightly, but it was loud. And neither am I. Get off this land. The leader laughed, a dry, barking sound. He leaned forward on his saddle horn, shaking his head with mock pity. I admire the grit, son, truly, but grit don't stop a bullet. I told you what would happen if we came back. The leader's hand drifted toward the revolver at his hip. Burn it down, he said to his men, his voice dropping to a bored command. Kill the boy. Drag the old man out and hang him from thee. The command was never finished. It started with a sound that wasn't a gunshot. It was a wet thud, distinct. The man to the leader's right, the one who had spat tobacco, suddenly jerked backward. An arrow, fletched with hawk feathers, had sprouted from his chest. He looked down at it, confused, his mouth opening in a silent "oh," before he toppled sideways off his horse. The thud of his body hitting the ground was the signal. The yard exploded. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. The ground itself seemed to scream. The warrior, hiding under the dust blanket 20 feet away, erupted from the earth like a demon, a war club in hand, hamstring the closest horse before the rider could even scream. The horse went down, throwing its rider into the dust where he was silenced instantly. From the barn loft, a rifle cracked, and another bandit spun out of his saddle. Chaos reigned. The horses panicked, rearing and bucking, trapping the riders in a swirling vortex of dust and confusion. The leader, his face twisted in sudden, primal shock, tried to draw his gun, his eyes darting wildly, looking for a target. But there were no targets. There were only shadows and death. Apache, one of the bandits screamed, the word tearing out of his throat as a realization of doom. It's the Apache. The fear in that scream was absolute. This wasn't a shootout with a rancher. This was a nightmare come to life. Natan dropped from the roof of the porch, landing silently behind the leader's horse. He didn't use a gun. He reached up, grabbed the leader by the back of his expensive coat, and ripped him out of the saddle with a strength that belied his age. The leader hit the dirt hard, the wind knocked out of him. He scrambled backward, gasping, looking up to see the barrel of Cassidy's Winchester leveled at his chest. And behind Cassidy, the towering, silent figure of Natan, holding a knife that caught the glint of the merciless sun. The gunfire stopped as quickly as it had begun. 4 bandits were down. 2 were on their knees, hands raised, surrounded by warriors who had materialized from the thin air. The leader looked around, his arrogance shattered, realizing that his week of terror had just ended in a minute of blood. The leader's chest heaved, his eyes darting wildly from the dark, hollow barrel of Cassidy's Winchester to the unreadable, granite face of the Apache chief. The silence that followed the violence was heavier than the gunfire had been. It was a suffocating, ringing silence, broken only by the groans of the wounded men in the dust and the nervous stamping of the riderless horses. The arrogance that had defined the leader just moments ago had evaporated, leaving behind something small, wet, and pathetic. He licked his dry lips, his hands trembling where he held them up in surrender. "Now, hold on," he stammered, his voice an octave higher than before. We can work this out. There's money in my saddlebags, gold. Take it all. Just let us ride out." He looked at Natan, hoping to find some flicker of greed in the savage's eyes, something he could negotiate with, but he found only a void. Natan looked at the man not with anger, but with the detached curiosity one might have for a stepped-on beetle. He reached down, his movements slow and deliberate, and plucked the leader's hat from his head. He crushed the felt in his hand and dropped it into the dirt. "Gold," Natan said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "You think the earth cares for your yellow stones? You think blood washes away with coins?" Cassidy stepped forward, the rifle stock pressed tight against his shoulder. His heart was still racing, a drum in his ears, but his hands were steady. He looked at the man who had beaten his father, the man who had threatened to burn their lives to the ground. It would be so easy to pull the trigger. 1 ounce of pressure, and the nightmare would be over. The rage flared hot in his gut, a temptation to finish what they started. "Give me a reason," Cassidy whispered, the words tight. "Just give me one reason not to put you in the ground right here." The leader flinched, squeezing his eyes shut, expecting the flash. "Cassidy." The voice was weak, barely a rasp, but it cut through the red haze of Cassidy's anger instantly. He turned his head. Gideon Flynn was standing in the doorway. He was leaning heavily against the frame, his face gray with pain, one hand clutching his bandaged ribs, but he was standing. He looked at the carnage in his yard, the bodies, the blood, the warriors standing like statues of judgment, and then his eyes settled on his son. "Lowered the gun, son," Gideon said softly. Cassidy hesitated, his knuckles white. "Pa, they came to kill us. They said—" "I know what they said," Gideon interrupted, shuffling forward a few inches, his breath hitching. "But we are not them. We don't kill men who are on their knees. Not unless we want to become what we hate." Nathan watched the exchange, a flicker of something like respect passing through his dark eyes. He turned to the 2 surviving bandits who were kneeling beside their leader, their faces pale with terror. He spoke a sharp command in his native tongue. The Apache warriors moved instantly. They didn't kill the men. Instead, they stripped them. Gun belts were cut away, boots were pulled off, canteens were slashed. Within moments, the 3 survivors were standing barefoot in the baking dust, stripped of their weapons, their horses, and their dignity. Natan walked up to the leader, standing so close that the man had to crane his neck to look up at him. "You will walk," Natan said, pointing toward the shimmering heat haze of the southern horizon. "It is 40 miles to the nearest town. The sun will judge you. The snakes will judge you. If you live, you tell your kind that this land has teeth. Tell them the Apache watch over the house of Flynn, and if you ever return." Natan didn't finish the threat. He simply reached out and drew a line in the dirt with the tip of his knife, a boundary between the living and the dead. The leader nodded frantically, tears of relief and fear streaming down his face. We're going." They scrambled away, stumbling over their own feet, moving into the harsh, unforgiving scrubland without looking back. They were small figures against the vastness of the territory, men who had come as kings and were leaving as beggars. Cassidy watched them go, lowering the rifle slowly until the barrel pointed at the ground. The adrenaline began to crash, leaving him feeling hollow and exhausted. He turned to look at Natan. The violence had drained from the yard, leaving a strange, sacred quiet. "Thank you," Cassidy said. the words feeling inadequate. You saved us. Natan didn't acknowledge the thanks. He walked past Cassidy, up the steps of the porch, and stopped in front of Gideon. The two men, one a white settler from the east, the other a warlord of the high desert, looked at each other. Years of unspoken history passed between them, but look, the firelight shared on winter nights, the silent truce, the mutual recognition of honor in a lawless land. Natan reached out and gripped Gideon's forearm, a warrior's handshake. The circle is closed, Gideon, Natan said quietly. The river is crossed. There is no debt between us now. Gideon gripped back, his hands shaking but his grip firm. There was never a debt, Natan, only friendship. You tell your people, tell them they are welcome at my fire. Always. Natan nodded once, a slow, solemn dip of his chin. Your son, the chief said, glancing back at Cassidy. He has a strong heart. He rides well. He did not tremble when the death came. It was the highest praise Natan could give, and Gideon's eyes shone with pride as he looked at Cassidy. No, Gideon whispered, Flynn. With that, Natan released his arm and turned away. He didn't say goodbye. Apaches didn't believe in goodbyes. They believed in the continuity of the spirit. He signaled to his men with a sharp whistle. The warriors mounted their ponies in fluid, practiced motions. They gathered the bandits' horses, the spoils of war, and turned toward the canyon. Cassidy stood by his father as the war party rode out. They moved as they had come, a part of the landscape, fading into the heat waves and the dust until they were just shadows against the red rocks. The yard was empty again, save for the scars of the battle. Cassidy helped Gideon sit down on the porch bench, the wood groaning under the weight. The sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long, golden shadows across the ranch. It was the same view Cassidy had seen 1,000 times: the rolling scrub, the distant mountains, the endless sky, but it looked different now. It looked earned. You did good, boy, Gideon said, leaning his head back against the wall and closing his eyes. You did real good. Cassidy sat on the steps, resting the Winchester across his knees. He looked at his hands. They were covered in dust and grime, but they weren't shaking anymore. He had ridden into the heart of the Badlands, faced the things that men whispered about in fear, and he had brought them home to save his father. He realized then that the childhood he had been clinging to was gone, left somewhere on the trail to the Apache camp. Pa! Cassidy said softly, watching a hawk circle in the distance, maybe the same one Natan had claimed as his eyes. We need to fix the fence, and I think we need to build another room. For guests, Gideon chuckled, a dry, raspy sound that turned into a cough, but there was a smile on his face. Yeah, the old man said. Yeah, I reckon we do. The wind picked up, blowing the dust away, scrubbing the land clean, leaving the Flynn ranch standing, battered but unbroken, rooted deep in the earth that they had fought to keep.